Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Humane Podcast, your tech insider podcast on the data economy. From the physical circuit chips on your smartphone to the software powering GPT models, we live in a data-first world. Humane interviews the founders, investors, executives, and tech leaders that are creating the world that we live in for consumers and enterprises. Welcome back, listeners. Introducing Humane, the tech insider podcast on the data economy. From the physical circuit chips on your smartphone to the software powering GPT models, we live in a data-driven world. Humane interviews the founders, investors, executives, and leaders that are creating the world that we live in for both consumers and the enterprise. And on today's episode, we bring to you Sean White, who is the CEO of Inflection AI. Sean, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here for a lot of reasons because you've been at the forefront throughout your career working in computer vision and AI technology, all the way back from, early career days, pre-web, to now leading Inflection AI. If you could share with our listeners a little bit of your background and what sparked your initial fascination with human-computer interaction and how that's led you, of course, to evolve and brought you to the forefront of AI development with Inflection AI.
Great. So it's interesting that you framed it that way, in part because I think one of my first introductions to computers, beyond the kinds of things that I was experimenting with as a kid, was at university. I started working with this professor, Terry Winograd. And Terry was actually one of the fathers of AI back in the 70s and 80s. They even named a test after him, the Winograd test. But he had made this observation that it was just as important for us to include the human in how we were thinking about artificial intelligence as it was to think about all the computational aspects of it. And so very early on, I was influenced by a lot of both his writings and the classes he was teaching and some of the research that we were doing together. As you said, actually, before the web with things like Gopher and other systems were on the early internet. And I think that thread stayed with me over many decades in terms of the projects that I would care about, whether that was helping people communicate in some of the first web-based email systems or augmented reality and work at the Smithsonian or Columbia University or at Nokia on wearable devices, and at Mozilla in particular, where we really were working with many hundreds of millions of users on what it means to interact with the internet. And so all of those things, then, if we were looking at how technology can make our lives better, how it connects us in different ways, connects us with the world around us, connects us to the systems around us, when the opportunity to start working with Inflection AI came up, it was a very straightforward consideration, which was I'd already been spending time with AI and neuroscience. I had earlier on sort of co-founded this group that was looking at how we use neurotech and how we can promote that to help people. And I was trying to learn at my own pace all of these different things that were happening with LLMs. And Inflection was notable in the set of, and I mean the very small set of companies that were doing large scale models, in that it wasn't only trying to create the smartest model in the world, it was also really trying to take into account what it would mean for it to be human centered in terms of how the AI was created.
It's so incredible to hear about the focus on human-centered models, and we'll be having several of those questions throughout today's episode. But maybe taking a step back, talking about Inflection AI, it's a very notable name, definitely a pioneer and leader in this space, and yourself as the CEO of Inflection AI. Would you share with our listeners maybe a broad overview of where Inflection AI fits in the current AI landscape?
Sure. The AI landscape is broad. I mean, even if you think about AI, most of what we talk about right now tends to be around large language models, but that's just one type of AI. But we'll focus there for a moment because that really is the wave that we are all experiencing right now. And arguably that wave in terms of how it changes society and organizations and enterprises is as strong as the wave that came in the 90s with the internet. And so with Inflection, we have not just been building the largest of the large language models, which we have, but an entire platform and framework and system so that it can reach directly to end users and to enterprises. And what that means is that, there are some companies that focus on a piece. That is, they make a large language model, or maybe they make some fine tuning activity. We have been building that full stack where you orchestrate everything from the interaction with the user to all of the different models to the fine tuning that is used to make those models have meaning in different contexts to the inference and what that actually gets for the end user. So if there's one aspect, which is the tools versus the systems and solutions, which is really where we are, there are some folks who focus on consumer and some who focus on enterprise. We initially had and have a product called Pi. If you haven't used Pi, you should try it out. It's a pretty amazing experience, in large part because it's not just giving you book reports. It actually is using a lot of what we think of as collaborative intelligence to really provide the kind of Socratic dialogue that you would want from a system where you really get to engage with it. And then we've been bringing a lot of that to our new focus, which is really around enterprise. And where I think some folks think of these as purely computational systems, we view it as both a user interface and a computational system. That is, we really believe that a lot of the user interfaces that we have historically had, which take time away from us thinking about the cognitive things that we care about and the tasks, really can be brought together underneath this user interface and still actually have the benefits of a bunch of the computational aspects. And so if there's the tools versus the systems and consumer and enterprise, I think maybe the last two things that really, if you think about the landscape, differentiate us are one around scale and the other around what you can do with that, the sort of agentic part of it. And so in terms of scale, this was a sort of discovery for me, was that you hear lots of people talking about models that they have worked with, and they might be 1 billion parameters. That's a big number, certainly for me to think about. But we have seen scaling for these models where we work with models that are over 350 billion parameters in size. And that kind of scale takes a certain expertise and really almost a certain kind of alchemy that only a few companies in the world have. And that makes a difference in terms of the experience you have when you're using OpenAI or Anthropic, in some cases Microsoft or Google. These really are a different scale from the smaller models that you get. And it's also true that scaling also comes from inference. So one of the benefits of us starting off with Pi as one instantiation of our system is that we have gotten fantastic experience doing inference with a large collection of people. Well, I think over 14 million people have used or tried out Pi over the last year. And being able to handle that kind of scale of inference really is enterprise scale. It's not just kind of an experiment on a laptop.
So, with all that in mind, Sean, you've been talking about the shift towards enterprise solutions. How do you plan to balance maintaining Pi as a consumer product while focusing resources on your enterprise offerings?
That's a great question. So, one of the first startups that I ever did was a company called Whoware. I mentioned this going all the way back to when web based email was a fantastic new technology that many of us had not seen. And, there was a report from Mary Meeker there might be as many as 40 million people using the internet. And that company, we had a main consumer product called Mail City. And then we white labeled to a bunch of other companies like Lycos and Excite and hundreds of other companies where we then provided the commercial product. And that let us do a couple of things. One was evolve the core technology and work with end users and get really direct responses and reflection from people who were using the system themselves, and also get the feedback that we could get from customers, the folks who are paying for this and helping us grow and scale this company. And my mental model is that we can do the same thing here. The focus certainly is on the enterprise, but we are still learning a lot from the kinds of things that we release in the consumer product. And so we don't have plans for that to go away.
Fantastic. And can you tell us a little bit about Inflection AI's studio business? As you've shared, as Inflection transitions from a consumer focused company to an AI studio for enterprises, how do you approach crafting, testing, and fine tuning custom generative AI models for commercial customers?
There are a couple ways to think about it. One, so one of my partners, Ian McCarthy, often talks about how our product is our dialogue with our users. And in the consumer space, what that means is, you are putting something out there, you learn as quickly as you can from them, you iterate and you grow. And sometimes, of course you make mistakes, but you are sort of, because you are constantly listening and constantly iterating, you have the product that you're releasing out into the world. But for the most part, it's still kind of a unified product. And the concept with the enterprise and the studio is that while we continue to listen to the end users, we are also listening to the enterprises. And so, for instance, we will have these events right now called Voice of the Customer, where we bring in, say, a large insurance provider or a bank, a winemaker, or an airplane manufacturer. And as a group, we are discussing the kinds of things that we need and want out of AI. And then from the studio point of view, that lets us take a given organization and really craft what the fine tuning means for them. And let me double click on that a little bit. So, the reason that Pi has such a strong collaborative sense, that it's really great at dialogue. There was a Berkeley student who did an EQ comparison across all the different models, and we were the top model for EQ in her experiment. And that was all done through fine tuning, which is to say, you take a particular set of cultures and data and belief, in our case, tens of millions of data points that have been collected over years to really create the style of the responses and the behaviors that are there. And so if you imagine, you take any given organization, they have their own culture. They have their own things that they care about, the ways that they interact, their own style. And so we fine tune to that culture, which is part of that studio activity, but also to the data sets, the things that are unique to that individual company.
I love the story you just gave about the Berkeley student, who did research and they saw Inflection AI coming out ahead with EQ. And Sean, as you rightfully noted, Inflection AI has emphasized emotional intelligence alongside cognitive abilities in your AI development. Would you elaborate on how this dual focus has influenced your approach to enterprise AI solutions?
Sure. Part of this, as you know, we are a public benefit corporation. And in part, the reason for that, the reason they have that double bottom line, is because AI really is at a moment, one might say an inflection point, where everything is changing. And it has the potential to change not just our small workflows, the things that we do when we respond to email, or we talk to somebody, or we're trying to solve a problem, really make changes to our organizations in ways that we can't really predict. And so for us, one of the aspects of that then is that if we are creating tools that are going to have that kind of impact, we want to make sure that those tools are crafted in such a way that they actually are making us all better. And if you think about, for instance, soft skills in an organization and the people who are really good at that, it's not just that you are productive, it's not just that you are getting things done or thinking at a higher cognitive level, but you feel good about the things that you're doing, right? And so for us, the emotional intelligence or the collaborative intelligence really has to do with not just making a smarter, more intelligent calculator, but really something that we co evolve with and that helps us be better, helps us as an organization be better. Because really, as I said, we co evolve with these things. And if we make sort of pokey, brutalist tools, then we end up with pokey, brutalist organizations. And if we make these tools that really are collaborative and supportive and help you think at a higher cognitive level, those are the kind of organizations we create.
I think that makes sense. Absolutely. All about, being better together. And I've been a big fan of open source. I know throughout your career, you've been involved, Ashan, in open source initiatives. How does your philosophy around open source influence Inflection AI's approach to AI development and deployment?
It's a good question. So you're right. Certainly at Mozilla, spent a lot of time as the chief R&D officer with a bunch of different open source projects. And I think one of the best lessons I got there, and to be clear, there were so many smart people, so many smart projects taking different approaches to open source, was that you don't want to just open source something by default. You want to open source something by design. And what I mean by that is, I think that, sometimes there's this dichotomy created, which is, oh, well, everything should be open source because that's just the way the world should be. And some cases where everything should be closed source because that's just the way the world should be. But if we think about what things you want to be open and why, that is being open by design, that gives you some guidance on what parts you care about for that and what parts you don't. And so, for instance, if what you care about is transparency or security, then that's one form of open source and even the governance structures you have for that. If what you care about is bringing stakeholders together because you have lots of different organizations, that's another form of open source. And so you structure the governance like that. And that's what the team did with, for instance, new programming languages like Rust. And it matters a lot for us here. I think one of the places, and we are still trying to sort some of this out, but it also arguably is a differentiator for us, is that we are thinking about how we share that source, whether that is licensing or different portions that are shared out, or even just the data and the ownership of the data for individual users. And maybe an example of that is that one of the announcements that we made recently was that we were working with DTI, which is an organization that is focused on data transfer and data transfer initiatives so that our users could actually have their own data be their own. They could have it be portable if they wanted to take that data that really is theirs and use that for themselves or take that to another service, they can. And we think about that spirit a lot in terms of the ways that we're working with enterprises, which is to say, really, they should own their own data. They should own their own intelligence. So a lot of those influences continue on as we are setting up and creating some of our partnerships today with Inflection AI.
That's a perfect segue into the final section for today's show, more on the enterprise side. So, Inflection AI is known for having one of the top tier language models. And for enterprises evaluating LLMs, perhaps you could share with our listeners what would be a use case or two that you think are most ideal for Inflection AI's offerings and why?
So let me give you a couple. One, which is in some ways sort of a simple block and tackle, but I think it's really meaningful, is use cases where organizations, and we're hearing a lot of this, is organizations where they have an incredible amount of data and they would like a better interface to all of that data, just even internally. Now, in that case, some people might take what's called a RAG approach, where you create a vector database and you're just sort of grabbing data piece by piece. And that's certainly a solution. But if you actually have data that is interrelated, that is, it's not just little lines, but all these different pieces need to work together, that's when you really need fine tuning. And that's one of the things that we are really good at. We have a great platform and framework for doing that. As I mentioned earlier, we also have what I think of as a fantastic user interface layer. And so, if you're trying to learn something, right, there's all this great research and study about how we learn and the Socratic method, for instance. It's generally not ask a question, get a book report. It's really about dialogue. It's about collaboration. It's about having coworkers and the ways that you learn these things. And so some of the use cases that we have been working with partners on are exactly that, where it is a user interface to multiple heterogeneous collections of data that actually need to be interrelated. I think there's another one that has been interesting as well. And that is actually where not only do you care about the interface, but you care about aggregating in some interesting way some of the agentic aspects of that. In some ways, agentic is a buzz phrase you hear everywhere all the time. But we have some partners that we're working with, and we'll be making some announcements in the future about this, where it's not just that you have an interface to an activity or an action, but a whole collection of those across your enterprise. And of course, those are heterogeneous. They are, from lots of different providers, and you need something to aggregate that so that, again, you can think at a higher level, that you have an interface and an interaction and a dialogue that is not just about that small task, but really being in the cognitive flow of getting things done.
I love that. Now, moving forward to what's next. Inflection AI is working on getting AI into the hands of enterprise users. Can you share your vision for how this rollout will happen, both initially and in the near to midterm?
Sure. So we're already doing that. Our approach has been twofold. We created an API to our system. And we, we unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it's hard to figure out exactly how you look at it, but we have over 10,000 organizations that have signed up for that. And we are slowly letting them test these out and build things and incorporate that into their own products. And this has been great because it helps us learn. It helps us understand the diversity of the kinds of things that people want to do with Inflection and the developer API. And that's ranged everywhere from, someone who wants to create a company where they are talking to their spreadsheets, or someone who is changing the ways that we do review cycles, or someone who is creating a chatbot for how we work with well-being and health. It's a huge range. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have, as I mentioned, these voice of the customer meetings and the large Fortune 500 enterprises. And with them, we're spending a bit more time really on the overall solutions, on some of the fine tuning aspects of that, and even where their needs are. So, for instance, there are some partners who have regulatory constraints or they just care about their data. So we can provide, for instance, an instance and hardware and have this on-prem for them in ways that some of the other providers really can't. That together, this gives us large exposure to a lot of new experiments, new enterprises, as well as some of the deeper integrations for companies who really want to own their own AI, own their own intelligence, own their own data. And we are working our way through each of those. And in part, that's why I've been continuing to try and hire as fast as I can, is to be able to grow our ability to work with all of those different partners.
Fantastic. And Sean, as we wrap up, I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak directly to our listeners. What's the most important thing you want them to take away from our conversation today? And what's one actionable step they can take to engage further with your work, with Inflection AI's work and ideas that we've discussed?
I think that the ask for everybody out there that is listening is to go beyond thinking of these systems as chatbots, go beyond thinking of them as computational systems, really be creative in thinking about how you could take the activities, the things that are in your enterprise, in some ways aggregate those together so that all of the folks at your company can actually work at a higher cognitive level, the ways in which they could really accelerate the things that they are doing. And as we've been working with different partners, the creativity around that, that is thinking beyond the sort of existing simple book report AI systems, I think is really bringing out some new use cases and new applications that are really exciting. So I'd ask people to think about that, really be creative. And then once you've done that, reach out to us. You can go to inflection.ai, you can sign up to be an API user, reach out to our team, and we're excited to work with you to build the next generation of AI and really build it in a way that makes our commercial enterprises and our society a much better place to be.
Sean White, CEO of Inflection AI. Thank you for joining us on Humane.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Humane Podcast. Did the episode measure up to your thoughts on ML and AI, data science, developer tools, and technical education? Share your thoughts with me at humanepodcast.com/contact. Remember to share this episode with a friend, subscribe and leave a review, and listen for more episodes of Humane.